Well, good. We're assembling in spite of the fact that we had a shortened time between the end of the worship service and this morning. And I'm sorry to say that Lori is still away. And so while our presentation this morning is probably pretty well known as far as the people, we're just glad that they're here and all in one piece, and sorry that you've had to put up with so much other activity. So with that, we'll just turn it right over to Steve to start, as I understand it, and welcome to all of you.
Well, good. I thought we were in for just an old-fashioned hymn sing this morning. I was asked since the Christmas music thing to follow up with another one of these, and I had been sort of dabbling with this for a month or so, collecting some notes and filing them away in my computer files, and thinking that I would, this past week, sort of organize them into some thoughtful way. And the week sort of progressed, and we got busier and busier, and moved me toward the weekend when I was going to organize them and put them in order. And come Thursday, the power went out. And there they were in my computer, and languishing in my computer. And I kept getting promises from consumer that the power would come back on. They kept moving that back and back and back. And finally, toward evening, last night it came on. So I scrambled and tried to put some things together. I was going to give somewhat of a dissertation on the history of hymn singing, congregational hymn singing. And that's rather long and convoluted and a little bit hard to trace. But I will say a few things about that. Christian hymnody really derives from the singing of psalms in the Hebrew temple. At least that's as far back as we can trace it with any kind of authority. We really don't know that much about congregational participation in the tabernacle worship. But from the Hebrew temple anyway, the singing of psalms is very prominent there, and it continued well into the New Testament era. And the writing of psalms did not stop with the canonical book of Psalms. Psalm writing continued for centuries after that, and well into the New Testament era in the time of Jesus. And then we have a number of references in the New Testament that the early church was a singing church. There are examples of Jesus' followers singing hymns, including Jesus himself, as we have Jesus and his disciples sang a hymn. Was one of the last things they did after the Last Supper. And then there are passages that refer to the disciples at Pentecost and other times singing hymns. We have that famous passage of Paul and Silas leading an impromptu hymn sing in the Philippian jail in Acts 16. There are passages in the epistles that enjoin the church to sing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. One of our hymn books had that name as its title. New Testament scholars argue a little bit about this, but most of them agree that there are hymn fragments in passages in the New Testament itself. Notably in 1 Timothy, a baptismal hymn seems to be represented there, a confessional hymn. Some think the Christological part of Philippians 2 represents a hymn passage there. Some of the creedal statements could well have been sung as creeds. So there are good evidence of ample body of hymn literature must have been present at the time of that the New Testament was being written. It certainly is encouraged there. But strong congregational hymn singing doesn't exactly follow an unbroken line of systematic development that we can trace with any accuracy. It was widely diverse, differing greatly between the Byzantine East and the Latin West. Sometimes hymns were sung by the entire congregation, sometimes by only designated singers. Sometimes employing the simplest of tunes, even folk tunes, folk melodies, sometimes more complex polyphonic settings were used, usually in alternation with plain chants. It flourished earliest in Syria, it seems, all indications are. The earliest hymn texts we have in collection form is that of St. Hilary of Poitiers, which dates to about 360 AD. That's probably the earliest hymn book that we could call a hymn book that we have, followed a few years later by St. Ambrose of Milan. By the late Middle Ages, trained choirs, at least in the Roman West, had largely supplanted the congregational singing in the formal worship settings. Congregational singing in the liturgy was reestablished during the Reformation, however, by the Lutheran Church in Germany, and of course Martin Luther was a hymn writer himself. We have several examples of that are prominent in hymn singing today. The early chorale or German hymn melody was unharmonized, sung unaccompanied, although harmonized versions used various combinations shortly thereafter with the choir and organ and congregation developed. Swiss and later French, English, Scottish Calvinism promoted the singing of metrical translations of the Psalter. Austerely set for congregational unison singing. English and Scottish Protestantism admitted only the singing of the Psalms early on. In fact, the Anglican Church didn't officially authorize singing outside the Psalter until the 1820s. The principal impetus for English hymnody came late in the 17th century from the independent congregational hymn writer Isaac Watts. And we have ample representation of Watts' hymns in the hymn book before you here. And in the evangelical revival of the mid-18th century under John Charles Wesley firmly established hymnody in England and America, and then of course followed by revivalism here in America as we know it, and then the various branches of that is branched out even into camp meetings and spirituals and things like that, and we got an ample variety. Now, the real question that always interests me is why? Why is that so important to us? What purpose does hymn singing really serve? Well, of course, it's an act of worship. In other words, it's an offering. It's something that we bring to God. We offer up to God in praise and thanksgiving. And then, of course, it serves in other parts of the liturgy, and confession and creed and things like that are liturgical offerings. That's important. But the reason we remember them and hold on to them and pass them on is because they are evocative. You know, and that applies both to the music and to the poetry involved. They awaken memories, they arouse emotions, they make us pause and think and perhaps do something and say something and change course. They remind us of something that we ought to be or do or think. They awaken something in us. And that is universal. And sometimes it's the tune. You hear the Old Hundredth, and you recognize something important. You hear Geneva, Beach Spring, Finlandia, these familiar tunes, New Britain. It reminds you of who you are. I remember Karen and I went to the Broadway production of Amazing Grace. Wonderful play. And before the curtain called into the play, a lone actor came out. No words were printed, nothing flashed up on a screen, but the tune New Britain started to play. And that lone actor just raised his hand And the entire audience stood up and sang from memory the 4 verses of Amazing Grace. There wasn't a dry eye in the house. Something happened there. And if you hear the great Highland pipes playing New Britain, you know something about it. Something's happening. Other times it's the text, it's the poetry. And we hear examples of that as we go along a little later this morning. But there is a remarkable universality and recognizability about hymn singing. Even if we don't know the hymns, we recognize this is hymn singing. We see, these are my people. You know, I'm home with this. And I say, worship has to be organic to the community out of which it arises. Now, you know, I prefer formal worship, but I also worship with Ellen Quintrell. And that is about as formal as ham and beans, you know? And there are the drums and the guitars and the screens, and that feeds my soul. Something happens there. And I have been worshiping an untold number of places in the third world. And I'll hear a familiar tune, a language I don't know or do know, and something happens. I took a team from this church to Chiapas, and we would have our evening devotions together around a circle. And we worked side by side with elders of the church, of the Celtal church. And we fell in one night into singing hymns, and we had sort of a sing-off. We would sing a hymn in English, and they would sing the same hymn in Spanish. We were trying to sing if we could trick one another or trip one another up, and we couldn't do it. They matched us hymn for hymn with the tunes. Good old solid 4-square gospel hymns, you know, one right after the other. And I've encountered that so many places I've been. And you know you're home. Well, let's look at some of those. And I haven't chosen my favorite hymns here. I just kind of randomly picked a sampling of some that I thought were somewhat diverse. Some have interesting stories, and there are different types. Some are familiar. Most of them are from our hymn book that's before you. I had 3 of them written down that aren't. One of them is in Rejoice in the Lord, the old hymnal, and isn't in the new one. But interesting people and interesting stories are behind these. Thomas Andrew Dorsey, often referred to as the father of American gospel music, was a composer, Christian evangelist, influential in the development of early blues and 20th century gospel music. He penned over 3,000 songs. About a third of them were gospel, including Take My Hand, Precious Lord, and Peace in the Valley. Recordings sold in the millions and so on. He wrote Take My Hand, Precious Lord in 1932 in response to the death of his wife in childbirth and their infant son and his overwhelming grief. He told that story in a documentary entitled, 1982 documentary, I think it was entitled Say Amen, Somebody. But that has been recorded over and over again, published in over 40 languages. It was Martin Luther King Jr.'s favorite song. He often invited gospel singer Mahalia Jackson to sing it, had civil rights rallies to inspire the crowds. At his request, she sang it at his funeral in 1968. His last words, we're told, before his assassination, was a request for musician Ben Branch to play it at a service he was due to attend that night. His exact last words were, "Ben, make sure you play Take My Hand, Precious Lord. In the meeting tonight, play it real pretty." There was an anthem by Roy Ringwald that wove into that anthem King's words from the I Have a Dream speech and his last sermon I've been to the Mount, I've seen the Promised Land. And I did that with my choir in Grand Rapids and got Roger to have this choir do it. So it is in our files here. And we did it for Martin Luther King's birthday was the following day, and we did it here. And it was astounding to hear our third church choir do that. We need to resurrect that. It was just, look it up on YouTube sometime. One of the great choirs singing it. It's marvelous. That is number 465 in the hymnal. I think we can do the 3 stanzas of that one. Nice. I was at the bedside of Lillian Van Dyke as she lay dying, holding her hand, and I sang that song to her. And the nurse walked in and joined me on the last verse. I'll never forget that. Yeah. The next one was written by Matt B. Davenport Babcock, minister of the Presbyterian Church in New York. It was published posthumously. He lived in Lockport, New York, and took frequent walks and runs. He was an athlete along the Niagara Escarpment to enjoy the overlook, panoramic vista of upstate New York scenery and Lake Ontario, telling his wife he was going out to see his father's world. He died in 1901 at age 42, and shortly after his death, his wife Catherine published a compilation of his writings entitled Thoughts for Everyday Living that contained the poem My Father's World. The original poem contained 16 verses of 4 lines each. It was set to music later in 1915 by Franklin Shepard, a close friend of Babcock's, to the tune name Terra Beata, which means blessed earth in Latin. Shepard adapted the music from a traditional English melody that he'd learned from his mother as a child. Babcock, incidentally, was himself an accomplished musician at the piano, organ, and violin. When sung as a hymn, 2 stanzas of the poem are put together to make one verse of the hymn. And there are a number of verses, not all of them are published in a book, but let's see which ones I want to sing. We won't sing all of them. It's number 21 in your hymnal here. I should have kept my glasses on. Okay, we'll sing 1 and 3, but I have been for a few years kind of looking after a neighbor friend of mine. I see him a couple times a week, and for a while I took him to his cancer treatments. Very sophisticated man. He was a dean of one of our state universities, but now is in advanced dementia. He would get riled up about the political situation in our country. And then he'd remember something. He said, my mother used to quote me the old hymn, "This is my Father's world. And lest I ne'er forget that though the wrong seems oft so strong, God is the ruler yet." Why do we sing hymns? When people are losing their faculties, one of the last things to go are the hymns. It is important that we give people good stuff throughout their life. That is critically important. That's something I learned years of calling in nursing homes and stuff. Give people good stuff. Okay, let's sing verses 1 and 3. The last half, the third verse, that's what happens. You take 2 stanzas of the poem to make 1 verse of the hymn. Yes, Judy.
I do know that when there is dementia,
Yeah.
not only the words, but the music
Yeah.
itself, how they can catch to that, just like that,
Yeah.
and start doing
Yeah.
da 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 da, even if they can't say the words.
Yeah. They may have forgotten their children's names, but they'll remember the hymns. That's true.
Could you paraphrase anything she said? Did everybody hear her?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Judy said they remember the tunes as well as the words. People do. That's for sure. The next one was penned by hymnist Horatio Spafford and composed by Philip Bliss. It was written after tragic events in Spafford's life. The first was the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, which ruined him financially. Spafford had been a successful lawyer and invested significantly in property in the area of Chicago that was extensively damaged by the Great Chicago Fire. His business interests were further hit by the economic downturn of 1873, at which time Spafford had planned to travel to England with his family on the SS Ville du Havre to help Dwight L. Moody's upcoming evangelistic campaigns. In a late change of plans, Spafford sent his wife Anna and their 4 daughters ahead while he was delayed on business concerning zoning problems following the Great Fire. While crossing the Atlantic Ocean, there was a collision with an iron vessel, a Loch Earn, and the ship went down, taking 12 minutes to sink, killing 226 of the passengers, including the 4 daughters. His wife survived and sent, when they arrived in Cardiff, Wales, the now famous telegram, "Saved alone." Shortly afterward, he traveled to England to meet his grieving wife. And he was inspired to write these words as the ship passed over the spot near where the captain indicated that the tragedy had taken place, when sorrows like sea billows roll. Bliss called the tune Ville du Havre, the name of the stricken vessel. This is number 451. Let's see how we're doing time-wise. Not very well. Let's sing the first and the last verse. 451. In peace like a river attendeth my soul, when sorrows like wee billows roll. Ever the thought thou hast taught me to say, it is well, it is. I occasionally would sing the third verse following the prayer of confession, which is very appropriate for that. Karen Porter sang this once as a solo from the gallery in church. And I said to her, I've known Karen literally since she was born. I asked her to sing it at my funeral. Not today. I want to do one other one, this Swedish poem, Tryggare kan ingen vara, No One Can Be Safer, written by Carolina Sandell Berg, who is known as the Fanny Crosby of Sweden. In 1850, it was set to Swedish folk tune, and it was translated into English in 1925 by the Swedish-American journalist Ernst Willem Olsen. But she was the daughter of a Lutheran pastor to whom she was very close, and she wrote hymns partly to cope with the fact that she witnessed his tragic death by drowning. Many of her 650 hymns were used in the revival services of Karl O. Rosenius, and a number of them gained popularity, particularly because of the musical settings written by gospel singer Oscar Arnfeldt. Now, Jenny Lind, the famous Swedish soprano, underwrote the collection, the publishing of that collection of Arnfeldt's music, which consisted mainly of Lena Sandell Berg's hymn texts. And now I could say more about Ernst, the English translator. He was quite prominent in the Lutheran Church and in the Swedish-American community, and published a newspaper, Swedish-American newspaper and so on, but I won't go into all that. But this is a beautiful hymn. Everybody who sings it loves it, and we sang it a number of times. They're often sung at baptisms and things like that. But the most prominent memory that I have is when we did it for Thomas Hoffman's funeral here, a 2-year-old that drowned here 20 years ago, I suppose it's been now. But it's just a beautiful melodic hymn, number 23. We'll just sing a couple verses maybe. Well, let's sing the first and last again. You can see the funeral.
As headmaster of Winchester College Chorister School, some years later, he was approached by a student about to travel to the United States who confided in Whiting an overwhelming fear of the ocean voyage. Whiting shared his experiences of the ocean and wrote the hymn to anchor the Lord and wondrous works in the deep. For he spoke and stirred up the tempest and lifted out high the waves. They mounted up to the heavens, went down to the depths. They reeled and staggered like drunken men. Their courage melted away in their peril. He goes on to describe it. The first 3 stanzas of the hymn appeal to the Trinity. If you look at them, the Trinity with the scripture passages where each person controlled the sea, imploring, "O Lord, hear us when we cry to thee for those in peril on the sea." The first stanza refers to God in discourse with Job, in which the Lord asks, "Who shut up the sea with doors when it burst forth from the womb? When I said, thus far you shall come and no farther, and here you shall your proud waves be stayed." The second one, the occasions when Jesus calmed the sea, the raging sea, walked upon the water when he swept through the storm. And the third, creation in the spirit hovered over the chaos, the watery chaos. The final stanza summarizes the hymn and promises continued praise from land and sea. John D. Dykes, Anglican clergyman and composer of over 300 hymns himself, many of which are still in use today, wrote the Tu Milita, which is an archaic term for Malta, the ancient seafaring nation and site of Paul's shipwreck, described in Acts 27 and 28. The adoption of the hymn for devotional use and benedictions in the armed services was first recorded in 1879. In that year, Lieutenant Commander Charles Jackson Train was a navigational instructor in the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis and master of the Midshipmen's Choir. And he began the practice of concluding divine services with the 1861 version of the hymn every Sunday, whereby it eventually became an academy and then a service-wide tradition, becoming known as the Navy hymn. And it was already known that way in the United Kingdom. Additional variants have been written, verses added as the Navy technology grew to include the Marines.
And then the naval aviation, and on it went. And in different versions, it became the Traveler's Hymn. But anyway, you have it there. Have we got time to sing? Let's do the 3 verses there. 4 verses. If I have time, I'll come back to that quaint hymn, He Who Would Valiant Be. I'd love to tell the story of John Bunyan, who wrote that hymn. I went back all the way to 1927 Reformed hymnals and couldn't find it. But it wasn't some of the hymnals that we use in the Midwest. So many Reformed church hymnals use, worship and service hymnal and so on. And so it was widely sung, at least in Midwestern Reformed churches. And it's enjoying a revival, including some of the quaint verses from the 17th century where it talks about foul fiends and hobgoblins and things like that in the text. It's fascinating. Now, according to folklore, St. Patrick was a missionary in Ireland in the 5th century, and King Logar of Tara decreed that no one was allowed to light any fires until the pagan festival was begun by the lighting of the fire on Slane Hill. In a move of defiance against this pagan ritual, St. Patrick did light a fire. And rather than execute him, the king was so impressed by his devotion that he let Patrick continue his missionary work. 3 centuries later, 6th century monk Dallin, St. Dallin, he's known as Forgal, wrote the Irish poem Rop tu Mobile to remember and honor the faith of St. Patrick. Forgal was martyred by pirates, but his poetry lived on as part of Irish monastic tradition for centuries, eventually becoming the Irish hymn Beathusa Moshul, which in early 20th century, Mary Elizabeth Byrne translated into English, and in 1912, Eleanor Hull versified the text into what is now a well-loved hymn and prayer that at every moment of our lives, God would be our vision above all else. We probably should recognize that some attribute the poem much later, but there's a lot to argue for that early attribution. The long text of the poem, Rop tu Mobile, Be Thou My Vision, incidentally, you can find t-shirts with that saying on it in Ireland. And people utter, it's sort of like Aaron go Brock, rope to my barrel. People shout that out. Reflects aspects of the early Christian Ireland. The prayer belongs to a type known as a lorica, a prayer for protection, a symbolic use of the battle shield and sword to invoke the power and protection of God. Draws on St. Paul's epistle to the Ephesians, the armor of God, the shield of faith. That kind of hymnology of Christian monasteries of the period due to the prevalence of clan warfare going on in Ireland, across Ireland. But anyway, Slane, the name of the hill on which the defiant fire was lit, is the old Irish folk tune with the ballad With My Love on the Road in Patrick W. Joyce's old Irish folk music and songs. It became the hymn tune when it was arranged by David W. Evans and set up the Irish hymn, Be Thou My Vision. It's one of the most popular hymns in the UK and is also sung, and increasingly so, in both its Irish and Scottish Gaelic versions. It's absolutely beautiful when it's sung in Irish. Go to YouTube. There's all kinds of that say it's in Gaelic, but there's a couple of them that actually have it in the Gaelic version with an Irish flute in the background. It is beautiful. It's worth tracking it down on YouTube. But let's sing. Let's see how many verses. 859 in your hymn book. And you know it well. I didn't discover this until I was coming out of the Army and returning to college. And they sung it all the time when chapel was required at Hope College. You know, you got your ticket punched to go into chapel. And this was almost every service they sang this hymn. And it's stuck. Let's sing the first two verses. Yeah, we're running out of time. Let's sing the first two verses in May.
Writing poems and songs, and this is his best known work. This is my song, and the stanzas 1 and 2 were written in 1934 when he was just 22 years old, often combined with several other additional verses by Georgia Harkness, a prominent Methodist theologian and philosopher from a time when females in such roles were extremely rare. The verse
chosen as the third verse here is one of that is most commonly used and appears in hymnals. Joan Baez, a folk singer, recorded this a couple of times. The poem is typically sung to the tune Finlandia by Jean Sibelius, who in 1899 wrote a musical score for a 6th historical tableau in a pageant that celebrated and supported the Finnish press against Russian oppression. In 1900, Sibelius revised the music from the final tableau into Finlandia, a tone poem for orchestra. The chorale-like theme that emerges out of the turbulent beginning of this tone poem became the hymn tune that we have before us. Johann Julius Christian Jean Sibelius remains Finland's most prominent musical figure ever, and I'm quite sure, if not national figure ever overall. A national hero and a treasure, he was largely responsible for preserving Finland's national identity at a time when Russia sought to dominate Finland right out of existence. He was a man of the world in the fullest sense, educated as a lawyer. He pieced together his musical training on his own initiative and was a world traveler, widely in demand in the most important venues in Europe as well as the U.S. Got an honorary degree from Yale. Deliriously popular, but more often than not, terribly dissatisfied with his own work. A lot of it he burned. He published 9 symphonies, same as Beethoven, you know. He battled alcoholism his whole life. His marriage was turbulent, but his long-suffering wife stuck with him till his death at 92. And there's holidays, his images on the, was before the what do they call it, currency today? Euro. Before the euro was on the 10 crown bill of every real national treasure. Let's sing. Oh, this song, I tell you what, it wasn't our Rejoice in the Lord. And I came to my mind in the 2016 presidential inauguration when the speech by the president kept pounding on that theme, America first, America first, America first. And I was hearing America first and to hell with everyone else. Follow the text of this song. We'll sing it, all the verses. Huh? Finlandia. This is my song, O God of all the nations, a song of peace for lands afar and mine. This is my home, the country where my heart is. Here are my hopes, my dreams, my sacred shrine. But other hearts in other lands are beating with hopes and dreams as true and high as mine. My country's skies are bluer than the ocean, and sunlight beams on clover, leaf, and pine. But other lands have sunlight too, and clover, and skies are everywhere as blue as mine. Oh, hear my song, O God of all the nations, a song of peace for their land and for mine. This is my prayer, O God of all earth's kingdoms, your kingdom come, on earth your will be done. Let Christ be lifted up till all shall serve him, and hearts united learn to live as spiritual hymn. I don't know why it didn't make it in this edition of the hymnal. It was in our last one. It's worth saving. Okay. Well, I was going to get to May the Mind of Christ Master. That's one I wrote as a choir anthem, the next one. It's in our hymnal, 334. Yeah. But
I would say if anybody feels they have to leave, please feel free, but we will stay for one more. I know this will be hard for Lori to hear you say, but our hard stop has come and gone anyway. So would you take one more?
well, if you're game for it.
And if while you're getting ready, some of you were not aware perhaps of what we were bringing for you this morning because you're too new to the church. But this is what we had for years when Steve and Karen were in pastorate. And we just can't say enough about how much they have meant to us over the years and continue to be. And since nobody's leaving, I'll save another few words for later.
Serving Third Church was the privilege of a lifetime, believe me. It was the privilege of a lifetime. This text attributed to Kate Barclay Wilkinson of England she lived from 1859 to 1928. Wrote this text in 1912 in 6 stanzas, inspired by Philippians 2:5. Let this mind be in you, that which was also in Christ Jesus. Little is known about her life. Member of the Church of England. The hymn has a rich tradition, though, of liturgical usage. In years past, it was used as part of the dismissal at the close of worship, which is how I heard it the first time when I first came in the Reformed Church at Maplewood. I was in the Army at the time, and it was sung right after the benediction. The first and second stanza, I forget which, and someone got the idea, and many have followed, that to change the me and my of stanzas, this is number 334 in your book, stanzas to you and your, so it could be used as a sung blessing at a wedding couple. And then, or on new members on the day they join the church, or sending out missionaries, or for ordination of church officers, and so on. And which is why I arranged it as a choir anthem for my ordination 50 years ago. It's found in Chinese hymnals and Spanish hymnals, and it's a beautiful little simple hymn to the tune of St. Leonard's, which Wilkinson shows that lived on, Gould, the Anglican priest who wrote the tune, lived on St. Leonard's by the sea and named the tune St. Leonard's. This is number 334, and if this is the last one we're singing, it's just it's a little short prayer. Well, we can sing the 5 verses. Just take a minute. A little. May the mind of Christ, my Savior, live in me from day to day. By His love and pardon, all I do and say, may the word hymnals in the hymn rack, in the book rack on the way out, that'd be great.
Put your hymnals, please, in the rack, and if you see one empty, in an empty chair beside you, please take. Steve and Karen, you know we save the best to last. And this is the end of our Mosaic term for this year. We'll start again in the fall. We thank you both very much, and for those of us who've known what to expect, we certainly have not been disappointed. And if you didn't realize, Karen was in the choir loft today at the organ, so she has many talents as well. So thank you all for being here, and thank you both for making this happen for us. And I apologize to the people in the Zoom audience that I didn't greet you, but I hope you were singing along right with us.
Thank you.